Presentation. Okay, hello everyone. My name is Martin Ledvinka. For those who are watching on YouTube and don't know me, and today I will speak briefly about how to use variables and environment to configure Docker and Docker Compose applications. So I will start with vanilla Docker, and then I will move to Docker Compose, which is probably a bit more practical, but just to get the basics of Docker itself. So there's basically two ways to configure Docker image or Docker image and container, and that's via arg and env keywords, which basically correspond to build time arguments. That's the arg keyword, and env is environment configuration. The big difference between these two is that arguments are really build time configuration, so they do not carry over to runtime. And also, if you use multi-stage builds, which is quite useful, then they by default do not carry over to the next stage either. So if you define an argument in one image or one stage of the build, it will not be visible in the next stage unless you tell Docker to do it. Also, if you don't provide default values for arguments and do not provide the value itself, then Docker will complain and the build will fail. And arguments are visible in the image history, so you shouldn't use passwords or anything like that via args. In contrast, environment variables are runtime configuration. They are accessible only at runtime, and they can be set either directly in the Docker file. They can be set via args as well, or they can be provided at runtime. I found this quite nice image which visualizes how they actually work, both arguments and environments. So basically, you can say either argument without default value or with a default value, which is usually a good idea unless you really want to force the user to specify the argument. And you can either set the environment variable via the arg or set it directly at runtime, or even using a file. If you have multiple environment variables, it's good to have them in a file so that it's easier to use them. Yeah, so here it is visualized in the build process of the Docker container or image. Now, if we that's actually quite simple. That's just these two ways of doing this. If we move to Docker Compose, there's basically equivalent concepts. One is called args, which is args is a section in the Docker Compose YAML file, and that's for build time arguments again. And these args are passed to Docker files of the individual services as the arg. And the other section is environment, and that's where you set the environment variables. But it's important to note that in the environment, you can specify either the variables that are explicitly mentioned in the Docker file, in the corresponding Docker file, but also any other variables that you set as the environment, they are passed to the container itself. So you don't have to specify all the environment variables explicitly in the Docker file. You just pass them from Docker Compose, and they are passed to the container itself. Yeah. So there is one kind of confusing concept. At least it was definitely confusing for me when I started using Docker and Docker Compose with variables, and that's the .env file and env file. So the file which is called .env, that's the name of the file, and this file can be used or is used by Docker Compose to populate variables used directly in Docker Compose YAML. Yeah. It's loaded automatically, but it has no effect. It's not passed to any of the containers. It just replaces values in the Docker Compose file itself. Yeah, nothing more, nothing more. In contrast, a file which you can specify for a service in Docker Compose, it can have any name, but the section or the parameter in the Docker Compose file, it's called env_file, and this file basically can be used to populate the environment similarly to using the environment section. But it's, again, since it's a file, it's more handy because you can edit it independently of the Docker Compose YAML file. It's much simpler to replace it or change it without changing the Docker Compose YAML file. It's also it's also analogous to the env file parameter to the Docker run command. Kind of confusingly, the env file parameter uses a dash, and the env file section in the Docker Compose YAML file uses an underscore for some reason. Anyway, I've been using Docker for, I don't know, a year, maybe a little bit over a year. So I found some kind of sensible patterns. I don't know if some of you might have much more experience with Docker, so maybe the patterns that I use are really dumb. But anyway, this is what I have learned over the time. So one thing that's always good is to use default values for variables, so that if you don't specify it explicitly, it uses some sensible default value, and it doesn't throw any errors on build or deployment. Another part is that I use the .env file for like build time configuration, usually some resource limits, mapping of ports or volumes. I don't commit this file to Git. It's just whenever I deploy a Docker Compose orchestration, I create this .env file and put these limits and mapping there. In contrast, I started using multiple env files, and what I do with those is that, for example, in one orchestration we had a central service, and this service used several other services, and so I basically had two env files. One was common configuration, and it mainly contained addresses of these other services, so that the user, when it's deployed, it doesn't have to they don't have to configure those manually. Yeah, so for example, when I was developing the application, I would use some localhost URL for the other services, and when it's running, I want to be able to use the Docker Compose network that's created for the orchestration. So this is where in this command, but the orchestration URLs of the services are always the same. They are defined by the Docker Compose YAML. Yeah. So what I do is that I put these URLs in the env file, which is common to all deployments, and I commit this file into Git. And then I create another env file, which is by default empty, or it's not in Git at all. And into this local configuration, I put any sensitive information or local configuration like passwords, URLs of external APIs, for example, in one of the systems, or actually two already. We need connection to a mail server because the system is sending mail. So this is the perfect place to put this configuration: URL of the mail server, password, username. Yeah. And what Docker Compose does is that it goes through the list of the env files, and it it uses their content, and if there is a conflict, so multiple env files specify the same variable, the last one defined wins. Yeah, so you can so what I do is that I first put the common configuration and file, and then next after it the local configuration. So whenever for whatever reason I decide to override any of the values from the common configuration, I can do it very easily by putting the new value in the local configuration. So this is the pattern that I've started using recently, and it seems to me that it works quite nicely. One bonus that I found for our applications, because most of them are the main part of the systems are written using Spring Boot, is that Spring Boot automatically reads the environment in which the application is running, and what it can do is map the variables from the environment to the configuration that you use in the application. So what I do often is that I pass values via Docker Compose environment to the Spring Boot application, and Spring Boot loads it automatically, and I don't have to declare it anywhere. The only difference is that instead of using this dot-based pattern, which is common for Java applications or Spring applications in general, you basically have to capitalize all the words and replace dots with underscores. That's because, as they say in the documentation, some operating systems don't like lowercase variable names and dots in variable names. So this is basically just some sanitization of the variable names. Okay, I have a demo prepared for you. Very simple Java application. It's using Spring Boot. It has two controllers. One is a development REST controller, and the other one is a production REST controller. They just return a map of some variables. It's a predefined set of variables, so it doesn't just load the environment. It's just two variables declared in the system. Yeah, and what I can do now, and what I use actually, is Spring Maven profile. And these Maven profiles, not Spring Maven, just Maven profiles, and these Maven profiles allow to select a Spring profile for the runtime. So what I can do is that I can build the application in development or production profile, and then deploy it, and it will tell Spring which profile it should use. So I will just try to run it here from the IDE. So this is what I would do when I'm developing an application. Okay.
Sorry, you said runtime. You mean build time profile?
Where is it running? Is it running? It is running. Oh no, I messed. So it sometimes happens in IDEA that it messes up the Spring active profiles for some reason. I don't know why. Now, okay, so now we have the development profile activated because we use the Spring Maven, the Maven profile. And so now if we go to localhost 8080 sample, we get this. So this is the profile, and this is just some variable value that I used. Okay. So now I will go back to the application, and I have a Docker file for it. It's very simple. It just builds it. It uses the profile specified as argument, as you can see. And so this profile is passed to Maven. Yeah, so now I can go to the terminal and do docker. I will call the image open mic. Dot. It's very quick because I was testing it yesterday, so it's basically everything is cached. So now if I run this application, it will use the profile specified with using the build time argument. So it will still be using development, but now this value has changed because I configured it. Because I configured it. Where did I do it? Here, right? So now the next step is that I will use an environment variable to tell Spring Boot to use a different value for this open mic value. And if I now go to the browser, you can see that the value has changed. Yeah. So this is one way when we are using vanilla Docker file or vanilla Docker. And now the next step is using Docker Compose. Again, I have very simple Docker Compose definition. I use the build argument again, and I just specify the environment like this. And now if I do Docker Compose build, again, the build should be very quick because I have everything basically cached from yesterday. And now I do Docker Compose up. It will use this environment variable and pass it to the application, and Spring Boot will, or to the container, and Spring Boot will load it from the environment and use it in the application, right? But we can go a bit further and use the env file. And what we can do is replace this environment, explicit environment, with an env file reference. And what I do here is first I again configure this open mic value variable with some new value. And another thing that I can do is that actually Spring Boot or Spring is able to pick the active profile from runtime configuration. It doesn't have to be selected at build time. So I am overriding this default value, which is development, and I am overriding it with active profile environment. So now if I build the compose.
Martin, could you show the Docker Compose file again, just for a sec? Okay, thanks.
Yeah, and now I will start the compose and go back to the browser and refresh, and I see that the profile production has been applied, the Spring active profile, and the open mic value as the value that I have in this and in the env file for Docker Compose. This is the compose configuration. So yeah, that's it. Of course, this example is a bit silly because it's very small, but I think that's the main gist of using variables. There's actually one more way of configuring Docker Compose in different environments, and that's just using another Docker Compose file and merging those two together. So you can have some basic Docker Compose YAML, and then have some other Docker Compose YAML that overrides some of the defaults and specifies, for example, some new services. And if you pass both of these files to Docker Compose, it will merge them into one and then start the whole thing. So that's another way of configuring an application based on the deployment, for example. But I found especially the pattern of using multiple env files as quite useful. So that's the demo. That's all, and yeah, the resources. The first one, this article is really good. Basically all I learned about the Docker environment and arguments. I mostly learned it from this article because the official documentation is quite confusing, at least to me, in this regard. So that's it. If you have any questions or if you have better patterns, I'm sure someone does have a better pattern that I use. I will be very happy to learn new stuff.
Okay, thank you, Martin. Do you have any questions, any of the audience?
Oh yeah, definitely have some questions. Thanks a lot, Martin. It was nice. Yeah, I would prefer, or I would like to see also some complex example over which we could discuss those patterns, because it's hard to discuss the patterns for me in this abstract way. But first, I would like to ask maybe something that were a little bit confusing for me. This active profile, what you did.
Yeah.
This was for me something very non-standard. Why would you have built Maven with development profile and then put here Spring profile activate? Is it like valid case?
Probably not really. I just wanted to show the the possibilities that you can have, because we used to do it this way, to use the Maven build to activate some Spring profiles, but it's really, since you can activate them at runtime using these environment variables, it doesn't really make much sense to do it in Maven. It
In
might
build time at all, okay.
be useful to just have a default one, but otherwise, no. It was just to showcase all the possible ways of configuring an application and overriding this configuration.
Okay, but in the application, or in applications, you typically have Maven profile for things to build, so you cannot mix them together.
Well, it is possible to mix them. It depends on whether you need it or not.
Okay, I think
I don't nowadays. I don't think I really use that much. Or actually, we do it in Termit. We use Maven profiles to select whether the application will run against GraphDB or RDF4J or something else, with and without Lucene indexer for the repository, because based on this we select full text search queries that are used. So that's what we use Maven profiles for, and there's without packing all the possible files in the archive, there's probably no way to replace this with runtime configuration. So
yes.
So if you have a situation where you want to pack something into the artifact based on some configuration, that's what you would probably use Maven for, right? But if you don't care, if you pack everything into the artifact and then select the suitable one at runtime, there's no point in using Maven profile for this.
Yeah. Okay, this is how I was thinking about it. About those env files, they are very interesting to use. Many of them. I'm just not sure about putting passwords to them. or I mean, this. So you would put passwords and everything in file that you commit.
No.
I know you don't commit password. I understand that, but on the server where you are running it, you just put password in those env files. This is what I thought that you said.
Yeah.
For me, this is a little bit strange, and I would prefer personally, but I'm not sure. I'm not yet 100% sure, but I would prefer probably to put it to different file which is not committed into.
Well, as I said, you don't have to commit the file. The only problem possible is that if you specify the env file and the file doesn't exist, Docker Compose complains. So that's the main issue. But you can you could also probably do it by passing the environment variables directly to Docker Compose. But the command then becomes a bit more complex. But so you would probably do it in some bash script or something like that. But otherwise, yeah. So for example, if you wanted something more complex, this is what we did with ngSafe in Akin. So we have a bunch of services, and this is the central service, and it depends on multiple other services. So what we do in this common environment file is that we configure this basic stuff like references to the other services where we want to use the Docker Compose network created for this application. So this is common for all the deployments unless something really has to change in some way. So this is what I would put in this common env file which I push to Git because I don't expect these to change, but I know that when I run it locally, I usually run just the one service, and the other services I run externally without Docker Compose. So these URLs would be like localhost something. So this is just to make the Docker Compose run correctly. Yeah.
For me, it's just a note. This is something that will not change, and it is dependent on this Docker Compose file because you define this RDF4JDB and everything else. So what is usefulness of having it and not including it into environment of Docker Compose file, environment section of Docker Compose file?
I see. Yeah, there's probably not much difference besides having the Docker Compose file shorter or easier to read. But yeah, you're right that we could just as well put it in environment here and it would work the same. Yeah.
Okay, and so then you override it with local. Could you show one of the local files?
Yeah. So for example, here, this is like these are the things that I would put in the common file, and these are the things that I would put in the local file. So for ngSafe, it's mainly mail server configuration and URL of the front end, so that the mails can contain links to the front end. Because this is what tends to change based on the deployment, because we might have a different mail server for a different deployment, obviously.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Definitely, it's nice to try to work with those and the files, and it would be even. I feel it has strength in to provide development environment locally or something like that. Did you try to use it for this purpose as well?
No, I'm quite old school in this, and when I develop locally, I usually run all the services outside of Docker. So I can't really say much about this because I don't really do it.
Okay. Thanks a lot. It was nice. I'll try to think of it, and I go over it and try to come up with some idea as well with that.
Like this,
I'm trying to push this to develop really within using Docker Compose. Like 90% of time, I'm running Docker Compose, and so I have some patterns for doing this, running this development environment. But with those end files, it could be much easier, probably. Maybe I would really want to look also to those two Docker Compose files combined together. I cannot really imagine how it could work, but this is also.
I also feel it must be kind of messy, but I saw it as an possibility of configuring Docker Compose locally or for different environments. I know that they mention it, that you can do it like this. But it feels weird to me as well.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to stop the streaming. So expect your